Okay, listeners, welcome to episode 37 of Picky Bastards. That means you have now listened to 37 hours of me, Matt, and Nick talk absolute shit about music, and those two get nearly everything wrong. So, thank you.
So thanks, Mum.
Yeah, thanks. Nick's mum. My mum doesn't listen, and my dad also told me it's just some people speaking, so he also doesn't listen.
I mean, he's not wrong, is he? It's just some people speaking. Let's be honest.
Tried to explain to him what a podcast was. Didn't really work. But hey, anyway, how are you two? How is Matt? I'll go to Matt first. How are you?
I'm good.
You're lying.
Sleepy.
You were just moaning about how shit you felt until 2 minutes ago.
Well, I need to go to bed, but it's 9 o'clock in the morning, so maybe that feels like giving up on the day.
Got that wrong, haven't you? Yeah. So
It's a Sunday.
Yeah.
And how are you, Nick?
I'm okay. I am just okay as anyone can be in this 2020.
It's nearly 2021, though.
Yeah, we almost made it.
So things might change.
Yeah. Don't speak too soon.
Oh, great. Thanks for that optimistic perspective.
Well, I mean, it is definitely going to be 2021.
Yeah.
We don't have to worry about that. Almost definitely, anyway.
Yeah, exactly. No absolute guarantees.
Well, what a lovely way to start that. Yeah. There is an album about the apocalypse on our list today. So, on that note, let's talk about what albums we're going to review. So, this month, our new releases are Pixel Bath by Jean Dawson, From a King to a God by Conway the Machine, New Symbols by Tom Beck, and Extinction Level Event 2, The Wrath of God by Busta Rhymes. The classic is Mazzy Star's So Tonight That I Might See from 1993. And then I'm going to introduce David Bowie and tell you why I love him, which was took me a long time to narrow down, but we'll get through it.
Bet it did.
Okay, so I'm going to start with Matt. And as it's nearly Christmas, I'm going to be all seasonal in my questions today. So, Matt, tell me, which song are you most likely to add to a Christmas Day playlist, and what does that say about the album as a whole?
Okay, I'm going to pick Starface, Asterix. That's in the Jean Dawson Pixel Bath album.
Okay.
And the main reason I picked this is just because there's some percussion in it that sounds a lot like Jingle Bells. It sounded appropriate to me. And so what it tells me about the whole album is really, like, this album is so much different stuff crammed within it. I was never quite sure what I always try and associate a genre with what I'm listening to just to make it easier and like to have comparisons to relate this to. But at points it felt like proper old indie. Then at other times you get this mix of R&B and then some big old 80 synths in there. And then at other points it felt like pop punk boy bands like Blink-182 and Weezer, and it was quite confusing to a certain extent, but then also, despite straddling all this like differences and disparate sounds, it actually, the core sound of the whole album was quite cohesive, which is surprising considering he's mixing all these things together. It felt like a reasonably good balance of like fun poppy songs, but then also I felt like below that surface level of like this fun pop exterior, there was some sad boyness to it as well, lyrically, and that just it made it a little interesting. I liked some of the vocals, the way that they were done, and the way that it felt like the vocals were turned up to 11, so that his voice was almost breaking a lot of the time and on the edge of blowing the mic out, which is kind of interesting. And there were a lot of the whole thing it felt complicated and simple at the same time. So I enjoyed this album. I wasn't blown away at any point. It felt kind of naive experimentation, but it was still enjoyable.
Okay, very good. Nick?
I'll say first of all that we had our Christmas do yesterday and I was not hungover at all after it until about a minute and a half ago. Now I suddenly feel like I'm really, really hungover. I don't know if it's just your dulcet tones, Matt, that's made me feel ill. But no, it's fine. I'll fight through. But
I'm sorry to have inflicted that on you.
Yeah, you basically poisoned me with your words. You've also done so because, I'll talk about it in a minute, but you did steal my answer to the next question, so thanks very much, as I suspected you would.
I thought yours might come from that.
Yeah.
I switched mine because I wanted to steal it.
Oh, you bastard. So, anyway, Jean Dawson, I was really, really ambivalent about this album. It took me a long time to make my decision about where I wanted to sit with it. I couldn't decide if it was really annoying or kind of even more scary, I suppose, fun. I was kind of nervous it might actually be fun. And I think overall in the end, it did win me over to the point where I did find it quite, I kind of enjoyed the energy in it and the sort of sunny disposition of it. I think maybe Bruise Boy was probably my favourite of the tracks overall. Although, and then also there was, I think the lyric that most represented the album was in Triple Double. He says this line, "Got confetti in my lungs," and I thought it gave this impression of like the positive energy behind what he was doing. That said, A$AP Rocky is on that track, and he's still shit. Everything I've heard with A$AP Rocky on it seems to me to be complete trash. So just putting that out there.
Okay. I've never really thought about it.
Right, wasn't he on the FK Twigs track? That was like the only track of hers that I hated ever. Anyway,
no, was that him?
Maybe
it was. Yeah, I think it was.
I mean, that track's alright.
It sounds like some bias right there.
I mean, I didn't like his music, and I have an opinion. So if that's bias, I suppose it is. Yeah. I thought it had some bits. I did like the mix of genres and styles and stuff. I thought it had some Beck in it at certain points, some of the early Beck in it. And I also thought it had some Frank Ocean in it, which I generally like. Some of the kind of more sort of R&B orientated stuff. When I got to the more annoying parts, it was to do with his vocals. Maybe it was what actually Matt was talking about around the grating sort of turn up to 11 time model of the vocal sometimes. Particularly Starface was probably the one I was most annoyed with. But I didn't hate it. I just found it a little bit irritating. I think as well, at its worst, the album turns into a little bit of 100 Gex at certain moments. Not nearly as bad as that, but in that ballpark. So, but overall, I think it did win me over, and I'm glad we put it on the list. Yeah, that's me.
Okay, cool. Well, yeah, I mean, similar stuff. I was pretty quick to dismiss this album on the first couple of listens. It felt chaotic. It felt a bit throwaway. It didn't have anything in it that really grabbed me, but over time, I kind of, thought it was quite an interesting album. Lots more interesting than I thought at first. In a weird way, it kind of reminded me of that Rina Sawayama album we covered earlier in the year, which I know there's a lot of people want to, it's on a lot of lists for highlights of 2020. I think it's not because the music's similar, but I think they're both albums that mix together a lot of genres and styles in a way that shouldn't really work, but kind of does. So I think, this album had bits of hip-hop, it had some indie, it had some R&B, and I think Matt's already mentioned Blink-182 and stuff, but it really did remind me of sort of early noughties skate punk on several occasions, which I'm not saying is a good thing, by the way. But I did then end up generally enjoying some of the album. I think the opening song, Devilish, at first I found it really off-putting, but in the end I actually thought it was quite catchy and quite enjoyable, and I think in that one song he melds a few genres together, which was quite impressive. I thought Dummy was probably the most indie song, and I quite like that. My favourite was Policia, which is like a multi-language anti-cop song. It's pretty aggressive, it's quite catchy. But I just like that because it's an anti-cop song, and I'm always here for an anti-cop song, so that might be part of it. But I ended up respecting this album more than I expected to. I think it's well put together. It melds a lot of genres together, but there is a lot of the elements of genres that I don't like, and the skate punk thing particularly stands up there. It's kind of, the whininess is a problem for me, and So yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting. I kind of enjoyed listening to it, but I can pretty much say I won't listen to it again, even though I didn't dislike it. So yeah, that's kind of where I landed, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think I've listened to something like this that's incorporated that skate punk genre before.
Yeah.
It's like interesting to hear, but also I think similar sentiment of that was interesting. That's cool. Next.
Yeah, well, it's that thing, isn't it, of thinking, and it was the similar for me with the Rena Sawayama album. Like, I know it's really popular, but for me, I found it fascinating to listen to. But it had like the Evanescence style stuff in it that just isn't really my thing. So I could find it interesting without wanting to ever listen to it again.
So I was a big new metal boy, so I loved the Sawayama album.
Yeah, see,
Linkin Park all day.
Oh my god.
Yeah, I was a Linkin Park fan and a Limp Bizkit fan in the day. Not gonna lie, but I was never an Evanescence
Really
fan.
Should lie if you wouldn't mind.
Maybe we should do Linkin Park. I might do Linkin Park sometime for a while now.
Really?
Make you guys listen to it.
That album's fantastic. I can't remember the name, but Hybrid Prairie. It's a great album.
Meteor is better.
Nah.
Maybe we shouldn't really get into this conversation right now as nobody's listening to it. It wasn't on the playlist.
Anyway, let's move on. So, Nick, you've already told us that Matt's stolen your answer.
I have a backup now, though. I still have a backup. So I managed to pull a backup out of the bag at the last moment.
Okay. So my next festive question is for Nick. Which song is most likely to make a New Year's playlist, and does that reflect the mood of the album?
Okay, I'm going to go with a song off the Busta Rhymes. I'm going to go with Slow Flow, the one that features Old Dirty Bastard. I found this to be the coolest song. I'm not going to include Bowie, obviously, but of the 5 albums, this was the coolest song of all of them, in my opinion. It was so crazily skittish and kind of, but energetic as well at the same time. It was just this bizarre 8-bit technology kind of synth all the way through it, which I thought was really funny, really amusing, and really kind of joyous. And then Old Dirty Bastard was also did a good feature on it as well, so that was really cool. And did it reflect the mood of the album? I think it did overall. I would say though that I wasn't expecting that much from it from this artist coming back after a long break. I think I understand I'm not an expert on him, but
10 years.
10 years, right? Okay. But this, I think, ultimately is a really good album. I really enjoyed it. I think it's got some bits, though, a little bit like Danny Brown, although it's not that good, but it's in that same ballpark. I think there are some things that pull it down. I found what I assume is Chris Rock doing the speech bits at the end of the songs to be incredibly irritating after like one listen. I kept having to skip past him, which was irritating. As he sort of shouts at me how Busta is the best ever, which, kind of undermines him in my opinion, because although it's a really good album, he's certainly not the best ever from my perspective. And then also there were a couple of features that were pretty weak, like the Mariah feature. That was a big problem for me. But overall, I think it was good. It was really entertaining all the way through. I think the worst thing about it is its title, which I think is ridiculous, really. Even though I can see where it's coming from, but it's just so overly complicated, it just doesn't work for me. So anyway, minor detail. So no, I did enjoy it, and I think I will come back to it, actually. That's my answer to that one.
Okay. So Matt, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure.
Did you forget you were on a podcast for a second?
Shifted off.
I have mixed feelings about this album. Like certain aspects of it are really, really cool. It's an absolutely relentless tirade of an album, and I found it quite exhausting. Especially as it's an hour and 20 minutes long. It doesn't let up. It goes hard for the whole thing. And there is the kind of lack of like ebbing and flowing within that. It makes it a tough listen, I find. But that said, there's obviously a lot of good shit in there. It's just a lot. I do appreciate like the fact that he came back and he's made this album that is very much it seems like his style of album. I haven't really listened to him before, but it has this very classic feel to it, and you can see from the features involved, right? Like you have Mariah Carey, which Nick mentioned, but also like Mary J. Blige, Old Dirty Bastard, and Q-Tip. Like a lot of those have still been doing stuff, but like they're very much callbacks to a certain generation, and so that with the like the style of the music as well very much feels like this hardcore rap album that I haven't really either been looking for or heard in the mainstream coming out that's being appreciated by people for a while.
So when you just to interrupt you for a second, would you say then, just in terms of this question was originally about New Year's playlists and stuff, that's a question that Fran put to me. Yeah. When you say it goes hard all the way through, if you weren't stuck in your flat listening to it, would it think it'd be better? I mean, if you're in a club hearing it.
I don't know. I haven't been to a club in a long time yet.
That's a fair point. Me neither. I can just imagine, though. I can imagine that's all it is.
It has a lot of like vitality and energy to it, but a lot of that is also very. Well, like a lot of hip hop, right? It frames itself as this. He is like it's the end of the world, right? Because of all this bad shit that's going on, like climate change and police and the vaccines, so, like a lot of hot topics at the moment. But then it's really an album about him being back and being awesome.
As Chris Rock points out.
90% of the album is, and like a lot of that works, and his whole shtick works. There are times it doesn't though. Like I found the track with Rhapsody a bit much and a bit weird. The tone of that, where it just was very self-aggrandizing around his role in his relationship with his son, and just making Rhapsody be this person that apologizes the entire time just felt weird. Yeah, but I don't know. I don't think I'll listen to this again because it's too tiring. Maybe I can dip into it and find a song that I'll take out of it and put in a playlist.
Such an old man, aren't you? Jesus.
Yeah.
Hopeless.
It's weird for like a sort of party album in some ways for Nick to be the one that's connected with it more than you. It's normally the other way around. But
yeah. Actually, have you guys? I don't suppose you saw any of the videos for this.
I didn't.
No.
If you haven't, you should watch the video for Sar. Because at one point he's like riding a shark, and then another point he kills someone by just like holding his hand out and like electric bolts come out.
Nice. He's always gone pretty hard with his videos. He used to have some amazing videos back in the day. So
yeah.
Wow.
Cool. Is that you?
It's funny, and it's like eight minutes long.
Right. Nice. I'll check it out.
Me. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I kind of gave you a gentle nudge towards picking this album, Matt, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Like, I've always had a bit of a soft spot for Busta Rhymes. In the era when I was really into hip hop, like he was one of those people who was just popping up everywhere. He would have absolute mega hits, and then he'd feature on everyone's songs. And whenever he featured, he would sort of steal the show because like his flow when at its peak was just the best there was, really. Like so fast, so clear, so aggressive. I think at one point he actually held the record for the fastest verse in hip hop history. I don't know if he still has that, but on a track called Break Your Neck, I think it was. Incredibly fast. But the other thing about him was he was always very, very patchy, and I would usually prefer his features and his singles to the whole albums. Like the only whole album that I really liked was Extinction Level Event 1, which is why I wanted to listen to this. So I thought it was interesting seeing him come back with a sort of sequel to it, but honestly the only link I can see to the first album is the fact that it's a Busta album, so that's pretty much the only link. But and I'd say my past experience of Busta really played out here. Like it is a patchy album. I think it does have real highs. I think he really shows off that he's still got it on the opening track and the track with MOP. And I think Nick mentioned this track, but the track with ODB, which is ironically called Slow Flow, is the absolute standout here. I think it's got a really good glitchy beat. I think both rappers are sounding like they were like at the peak of their career on that track, so that's great. And I think the following track with Q-Tip, which is called "Don't Go," was another really strong track. And I think it was interesting to see then, as well as having all those like old school rappers, he did have a few of current names, and I thought the track with Anderson .Paak was really good, but I was a lot less keen on the tracks with Rhapsody and Kendrick. I wasn't really into them at all. And I think that's where we get to it being patchy. It's like Matt said, there are enough good tracks here for it to be a very good album, but it's padded out to an hour and 20 minutes with a lot of filler and a lot of bragging, which is standard, but it doesn't need to be that long. But I also think we can allow Busta a bit of indulgence after coming back after so long and being who he is. So interestingly, I think I'm going to sort of segue into talking about another album here, or one of you taking over and talking about the Conway the Machine album, because I think it's, without going too much into that, I think it's really interesting to see that the more dynamic and exciting hip-hop album on this list seems to me to be the one that's from someone who's been around forever more than from the modern artist. But I won't say any more about that now.
Who wants if you want? It's fine.
Should I go straight into Conway?
Yeah, do it.
Okay.
Just go for it.
Let me find my notes. So I wasn't left with like loads to say about this album. I think what was interesting, and thinking about the comparison to Busta, I also think it's interesting to think about this in comparison to the Chez Noir album we covered a couple of months ago. I think we talked about that Chez Noir album and how it harked back to like the likes of Pac and Biggie, and that she referenced that in the beats and even in the stories of the songs. And I think we were okay with that. We all enjoyed that album. Whereas I think Conway the Machine from King to a God, I think it's another example of an album trying to do that, sort of harking back to the old school. But I think for me, it had the opposite effect to the effect it had on Chez Noir. I think it was funny, like my first couple of listens to the album, there were a couple of songs that I thought that really sounds like another group or another artist. And when I looked into those songs, it turned out that those artists were on the songs. So Lemon, that he did with Method Man, sounds exactly like a Wu-Tang song. It just sounds like a rip-off of a Wu-Tang song. And as much as I always enjoy hearing Method Man, that song was just too much of an imitation of them. And then there's a track called Juvenile Hell, which, while I was listening to it, I was thinking the production sounded exactly like the production from the era of sort of G-Unit and The Game and 50 Cent and all of them. And then I found out that Lloyd Banks from G-Unit was on that song. So every song that stood out was because it sounded much like something else that I really used to like and that I preferred to this. So yeah, that doesn't mean I hated any of this. It was just a bit of a bland album, I think, that I'll never go back to, and it didn't really sort of it harked back to a lot of older stuff without doing anything interesting with that. I think the only song on it that I really like on its own merits was the track Anza, which featured someone called Armani Caesar. And I don't know who that is, but maybe this just sounds like one of that guy's tracks from 10 years ago as well, because that's what all the other ones seem to do. So it's kind of where I landed on that one. Who wants to jump in?
I can go. If that's all right. Yeah. I won't be long. So this album, in line with what Fran has said, frankly, is completely hip-hop by the numbers. I felt like it was just every cliche. It was so flat. It was every cliche came through, like the hollow bravado and kind of the toughness and stuff, and none of it really spoke to me at all. None of it seemed like any more than just, as I say, playing through the cliches, running through the numbers of what a hip hop artist needs to do. Even the title, From a King to a God, is just standard fare in it. I mean, really. Which
is the worst title though? That or Busta's?
I still think the Busta album has got a worse because it's got a subtitle in it, which I can't stand albums with subtitles. But From a King to it's From a King to a God, is it not? Capital letters.
I think that might be a Jay-Z and Kanye reference.
Okay,
which one?
Because they have a lyric. What's a king to a god?
Okay. And he does mention them on the album a bit, doesn't he?
Okay.
Or at least Kanye.
Yeah.
Well, that's giving him a lot of credit then that he's not suggesting he's the one. But yeah. So the flow is okay. Nothing really grabbed me as unusual or fresh in any way. And I think it is very interesting. I'm glad we did it in this order of talking about the Busta and the Conway together. Because I think the Busta album leaves the Conway album in the dust. It's got a lot more going on. I mean, I know it's longer, but it's got a lot more going on. It's so much more interesting, so much more energetic, so much fresher. So yeah, I don't know what else I can say really about Conway. It's not something I'll go back to at all.
It's interesting they both have someone bigging them up as the best of all time on the albums, and when the guy doing it on the Conway album was doing it, I was just thinking, not really, mate.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Busta is not the best in my limited knowledge still, but Busta is still not the best. But
the fact that he is, like, he has got those things
he's in
around
the conversation,
him,
isn't he?
He had the fastest flow of all time and all that sort of stuff. So he's not my favourite artist of all time, but he does have some claims on it.
Yeah, exactly. He's in the conversation. Conway the Machine, who is that? You know, like, frankly, So no, I don't think it is fair. Yeah, that's it for me on that one.
Well, just so you know, the fastest flow now is Ocean Wisdom.
Yeah, I thought so. I would have said
he
that.
beat him out.
Yeah, okay.
But
I'm not surprised.
But that doesn't necessarily mean better. But that's
I know whose voice I'd rather listen to. But anyway, we won't get into another argument about another band.
Yeah. This is going to be also quick. I have a lot of the same notes as you guys. I felt I made the same comparison to Chez Noir. For me, Chez Noir's album was homage, and this is, like you guys are saying, this is just following exactly the same path. And
that's a good point. Yeah,
paying respects. It's just I'm going to do what they did in a copy. But there, like, there's generally some stuff I like about it. There's very few parts that I do. The third track I liked a lot, the Method Man one, but that may be just because it sounds like Wu-Tang. I really like the heavy synth that's just throughout the whole song. I just really like that tone. But yeah, if they're just ripping off another song, that doesn't really count. And also Fran mentioned Anza. Anza to me sounds like a different song. It sounds like Vossi Bop, the Stormzy song. And that to me is why it stood out from everything else. It had a real grime sound to it, I think, which I enjoyed a lot.
It actually sounded like a fresh song, right? It sounded like a new song, didn't it, rather than an old? So maybe that's it. Yeah. Yeah,
and it's I like being able to hear classic, proper American hip hop taking influences from the UK and doing something with it, and I think that was done effectively in that. Although it did sound remarkably similar to Vossi Bop, but maybe that's just me. But that said, like your guys' comparison to Busta, I think it's fair, but actually, on reflection, even though this is just a mere album, I'm probably more likely to listen to this one just because I found Busta so exhausting. There's never going to be a point where I'm just like, I want to listen to 80 minutes of this Busta album. I don't think.
Why would you listen to the Conway the Machine again from all that you just said about it?
Because sometimes I just want to listen to hip hop but not think about it. This would be. This is a very.
It's hip hop lift music. That's what you're basically saying.
This would be a very much like hip hop by numbers, and like Nick said, I just want some generic hip hop.
Just put some good hip hop.
Because there's no other options, are there? That's the thing.
Yeah, I guess I could put some good hip hop on.
That's hilarious.
Or even some average hip hop, like, if you want to listen to something that's similar to this, put like the G Unit. I know what we think of people don't like 50 Cent and stuff, but a G Unit album or a Game album is actually more enjoyable than this album by quite a long way.
Yeah, I guess I could just do something else.
Yeah,
but
he's not going to.
No.
Yeah.
Very strange.
Is that you on?
Yeah.
Conway the Machine.
Yeah, that's me.
All right, we'll go to Nick. Do you want to talk about Tom Beck or Mazzy Star?
Let's do Tom Beck, shall we?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So this, I really wish I could draw a diagram for this album, I'm going to say, on air. I don't know how I can do that, but I would love it if everyone can just focus very hard on what I'm about to say.
Use your words.
I will. I use my words, yeah. So I thought that, just first of all, that the beats in it were reasonable. There wasn't much development in the beats, so I didn't really feel like they moved much, they had much of an arc. But the big story is that I think this album has possibly the worst lyrics I have ever heard in an album. I really can't do them justice by just reading them. it needs the context of the really droning vocals to deliver them, to really get how hard hit you are by these vocals. But I will give you an example as best I can. The song "My Child." I recommend everyone has to listen to this after and see, or pause this and have a listen and see what they think after I've gone through this. So basically, the lyric in the first end of the first verse is, "Knowing how good it is to have you in my life, yeah. It is not often the easiest thing to say out loud, but I'm so happy I found you. You're the one. My best friend in the world and now a mum of my child. Yeah, my child."
So, I didn't even notice that.
Yeah. So obviously, you're already laughing, so you can see that there's a few problems there. But just to be specific, the album, the lyrics are forced into these weird line breaks that don't make any sense a lot of times. So we've got "knowing how good it is to have you in my life" is just a really weird forced line that doesn't fit with the melody, and it feels like it's just clumsy. But then on the end of two of the four lines I just read, he ends up with the word "yeah," which I always think is a lazy move. If you've got an extra word, you've got to put it on a beat and just say "yeah" after it. It's just because you run out of ideas for the actual lyric. Then it's so there's wasteful stuff and like that, and then there's stuff that's crammed in. Like, it's not often the easiest thing to say out loud, but is a really weird line as well to sort of cram into that space. Then there's some things that are so staid, so boring, like, "I'm so happy I found you, you're the one." I mean, it just sounds so dull. And then there are some that are so awkward as well, like on the following line, "My best friend in the world and now a mum of my child," which I think is in brackets.
Very bad.
I mean, it's just bad. Shocking. It is shocking. So, honestly, although the music of it was okay, I wasn't in love with it. It was okay. This lyrical situation, along with the sort of very, very drony vocals, makes this album unlistenable to me. I mean, painfully unlistenable. And there's many more examples than just "My Child," although "My Child" is probably the worst of them. So yeah, that's a little bit of a close reading of "My Child" and that album. Yeah, so no, not my favourite. And also interestingly, I think compared to the Jean Dawson, which just has a little bit of overlap in terms of the electronica side of it, the Jean Dawson completely kills this album again. A bit like we've had with Busta and Conway. There's two pairs of albums out of these, I think. And the Tom Beck is not doing well in reflection of Jean Dawson. Anyway, that's me on that one.
Okay, Matt?
Sure. So I suggested this album because he, for a while, has been one of my favourite artists. His first album is in my maybe top 50 albums. I love it.
Yeah. I love the lyrics.
I like certain parts of this album, but yeah, the lyrical side of things are not. It's not his strongest work. Like, I'm surprised you didn't talk about "Slippery Fish."
Yeah, "Slippery Fish" is like some Monty Python, isn't it? Oh my god! Yeah. I don't know if he's actually trying to be funny or not in that one. I was kind of suspicious.
Yeah, like he must be.
Yeah.
But then it does seem like he is using this metaphor of just like you get through life like you're a slippery fish.
Slipping around.
You just got to kind of using it as a way of saying go with the flow kind of.
Exactly.
But like
aren't all
for
fish
me,
slippery though?
Maybe not.
That's a very random question to have a debate about right now.
It depends which way you brush them.
Why are you brushing fish?
What are you talking about?
They're scale. Anyway, just ignore this.
I really will, yeah.
Fucking hell.
That's amazing. That's the most random conversation we've ever had in 37 episodes. Are fish slippery?
Yeah, they definitely are a bit.
Anyway.
So it's a good observation on his part.
Back on track.
Yeah.
I think, lyrically, he's definitely taken a step backwards, right? He always had very straightforward ideas that he would repeat. So there's a lot of repetition in the way he delivers stuff, and that's always been the case. But he often mixed some like complex metaphors with the more like obvious ones. And it was at times quite abstract, the lyrics, and in this album that's pretty much gone. Like, there are metaphors, but they're not interesting or artistic, I don't think. musically, it sounds like a Tom Beck album. Like musically, it's almost like we've used this idea before or analogy, but like it sounds like someone aping Tom Beck by just doing all the Tom Beck things. Like it does sound like he always has this kind of like the way the drums are recorded, it almost sounds like they're in a well somewhere, and his vocals are always very monotone because he has a very like limited delivery style, but I've always liked that about him, that he just owns that. And then he has like these simple beats with the kind of lilting guitars all over it. But it just feels like all of these signatures are just a little bit more exaggerated than usual, and there isn't as much of a deft touch, which, yeah, it means for me, like, I'm just less interested in this album than his previous three. And to be honest, his first album was amazing. His second album was pretty good. His third album was good.
I see where this is going.
So, yeah, we're not on the best trajectory. But, like, it's still the album I listen to more than probably anything else on this list, just because I wanted to get as much from it as possible.
Well,
but yeah, I was pretty disappointed.
Okay, so yeah, it's interesting hearing you talk about it, Matt, because when you picked Tom Beck, I really recognised the name, and then when I listened to it, it was really ringing a load of bells. And then I slowly started to remember that you spent a lot of time when we lived together at university trying to get me to listen to Tom Beck. And trying to convince me that Tom Beck was good, but I couldn't remember anything about him when it came back to it, and that makes a lot of sense to me after listening to this album, because it just feels instantly forgettable. I feel like every time it ends, I can't remember anything interesting about it, either in a good or bad way, really. It just feels extremely middle of the road.
That's high praise, I think, personally.
It has nothing really to say. I didn't really pay much attention to the lyrics because I was just bored. I think occasionally, and I've written down Slippery Fish here, so we will have to talk about it again.
Yeah,
I think it's occasionally a little bit quirky, and that's about as interesting as it gets, but it's not really in a way that makes me think anything much about it. And I'm going to return to another debate from the last. Well, I don't think we did debate it, but we talked about how you spell the word meh, and I think that's another word that I need to use again today. I think personally, I didn't hate it as much as Nick. I didn't think there was anything offensive or horrible about it, but there was nothing exciting or new. I feel like it just kind of exists, and that's it. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about the Tom Beck album. It certainly wasn't the one that I listened to most on this playlist. It certainly was the one I listened to least. But yeah, so sorry to slate one of your favourite artists, Matt, but
don't worry. It's just weird. I think for me, it's this kind of alt pop indie sphere has moved so much in the past 15 years, and I think he's using the same beats that he did 15 years ago, and he was interesting and weird at the time, and now he's not.
So what you're saying then is he's not a slippery fish.
Wait.
He's not. He hasn't gone with the flow. He's too slippery. He's stayed exactly where he is.
Hey?
Yeah, that's
if you're
just
really
weird.
Slippery, would you stay exactly where you are?
I love how we got back to this ridiculous conversation.
Friction.
That's perfect. That's what I was hoping for, was that we spend more time talking about slippery fish.
All right, I'm going to move on. I'm going to start on Mazzy Star, this month's classic, So Tonight That I Might See. So I think we're 37 episodes in, and for the first time, I found a classic album that does what I was hoping all of the classic albums would do. So like halfway through the first song, Fade Into You, it made me wonder why I hadn't been listening to this artist for years. I love that first song. I think last month I talked about how much I enjoyed the Woody Guthrie, and I love the Biggie and the Nas classics that we've done previously. But this is the first classic that I can really imagine sort of going into my regular rotation and becoming more like one of my go-to albums. I think it's fantastic. I love that it's not neatly pigeonholed into one genre. I think it's got bits of soul, it's got bits of the blues, some psychedelica, it's folky at times, it's a bit shoegazy at times. And I think the fact that it's so varied and nuanced, it doesn't feel particularly dated to me. especially when you compare it to a lot of other music that came out in 1993. If you think about some of the early 90s music that's really dated, I don't feel that this is. I think it's a really dreamy, sort of mysterious sounding album. I think it feels quite dark at times. And I think there's just a really lovely, mesmerising interplay between the vocals and the guitar. I think they play off each other extremely well. I think her voice is incredible. I like all of the album, but I do like the loud, rockier songs. But for me, the album shines most when it's the quieter, more introspective songs. So I've mentioned Fade Into You. I really liked Five String Serenade and Into Dust. I thought they were the three best songs. But yeah, this was the album on this playlist by far that I listened to the most. And to be honest, a lot of the time when I listened to the playlist, I just wanted to skip through all of the other albums to get to this one. I think it's great. So despite not loving any of the other four albums, I really, really enjoyed this one. So yeah, that's me. Let's go to Nick.
Yeah, it's interesting. You used the word mesmerizing.
Yeah,
and I can see where you're going with that. I think there's a downside way of looking at it as well at times, which is soporific. I think when it becomes really, really that dreamy quality completely overcomes it. There are times when I found it, I couldn't sort of get a handle on it. I was just sort of let it slide right past me, and that was it was so passive, you know. And I'm not gonna. I'll back up and say I didn't hate this album. I thought it had some good bits, and I did enjoy it. I'm glad we put it on the list. But I think one of the things that I found a bit difficult about it was that the guitars, which were fairly heavy on quite a lot of the songs, were really set very, very low in the mix and tuned and sort of tonally sort of tuned down to be very passive and in the background a lot. So in fact, if you take a song like Bell's Ring? Was that the yeah? Mm. That song has actually, if you just really focus on it, quite heavily distorted guitars. And actually the song is still very dreamy, which I think is almost a pity, really. I think, to be fair, I think it may be sort of a victim of the production style of the times in some ways, but I wanted to have a little bit more bite. She's My Baby is another example of the same kind of thing, where the distortion has been kind of gutted, and the song is therefore very slight. But I mean, there were points I liked. I thought Mary of Silence, is that one?
Good song.
Yeah, that was a good track. In fact, that song and a few of them sounded very like the better side of the Doors to me. Like very like moody and delicate and slightly sinister. So yeah, I did enjoy it overall, but I think. Yeah, I just don't know how I sit with like the notion of mesmerizing and whether or not that's something that really holds as a positive for me, or whether I see it as a bit of more of a downer in a way. So yeah,
surely if you're mesmerized, that's a good thing, isn't it? Mesmerized
well, it's almost
by
like
music,
hypnosis, isn't it? It is like hypnosis, isn't it? So I mean, that would be just like put to sleep by, I think, in a way. So, but again, I'm not saying I totally felt that. I just felt that there were times when it was too smooth and too mellow for my taste, and I think as well it was positioned right after the Busta on the playlist, which was difficult for it because obviously, as we've all said, whether it's better or worse, the Busta is certainly a very loud album, so it came across as very, very passive after that. But yeah, glad we did it. Yeah, and it's a 93 album, isn't it? Did we say that?
It is.
It's a 93 album, yeah, so I've been obsessed with 1993 music lately, so that's interesting as well for me. Yeah, so I'm glad we did it. Thanks.
No, it's Matt.
Cool. Well, I'm going to take one word that Nick said, soporific. I'm going to say it felt mostly worse than that. To me, it felt slow, kind of processional, and at points pretty drab. I didn't think this album was special in any way. I felt like I was seeing a band in a pub. And it just really was just like, oh, okay.
The problem is though, if this band was playing in a pub, they would be so quiet that you wouldn't be able to hear anything they were doing at all, because anyone's conversation would be over them.
Well, that's almost it.
If this band was in a pub, I would not be talking to you two. I tell you that much. Fucking hell.
I guess some of what you said, like the levels were so weird and just everything was hazy, that it did feel like, a badly set up band just putting on a live performance, and you're just like, you can't hear anything properly.
What the fuck are you talking about?
I knew Fade Into You really well, and so this really wasn't an album I expected after Fade Into You, because it feels like there's Fade Into You and then the rest of the album, and Fade Into You is a fantastic song, and it's obviously the standout to me, but then after that it just kind of just fades away into this kind of folky, hazy, shoegazy, alt rock mix of stuff, which for me, it's just a
this is the most shite you've talked on the podcast, I think.
Wow,
that is
big statement.
I'm not surprised that you like it, Fran. To be fair, it hits a lot of your buttons, but it hits
good
a
music.
lot of the things that I
imagine to insult the band and Fran at the same time. That's amazing. Well done.
Well, it's just a lot of stuff. At the end. I did like some stuff. I think a song that you mentioned was Mary of Silence. Like the drums in that I really liked. They were very isolated in a way that reminded me of Joy Division. That I really liked because that was nicely mixed with everything else. It had a different sound. But a lot of the time I was just like, yeah, I liked her voice as well. But then I just ended up wanting to listen to Fleetwood Mac afterwards because it just felt like a less good Stevie Nicks.
I mean, Fleetwood Mac. You know my feelings on Fleetwood Mac. So
yeah, you're not a fan.
If you prefer Fleetwood Mac to this album, then it says everything we need to know.
I think Rumours is probably better than this by a quite a wide margin. I'm surprised by how much you like it, Fran. But
I think it's fantastic.
Yeah.
And I'm very surprised. I didn't think you'd love it, but I'm surprised to hear quite such a ridiculous reaction. To be honest,
I'm surprised how much you like it.
You like Tom Beck. Anyway, let's not just argue.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well.
No.
I'm not going to.
I'm surprised at the
this Tom Beck album.
I'm surprised at the vast opinions on that album. I actually thought the Mazzy Star would be at least relatively popular with both of you, but fair enough.
Fade Into You is an awesome song.
I kind of find it surprising you think that that's different from the rest of the album, though. I mean, I didn't hate it or love it, but I think it was pretty consistent with the general dreamy quality of the album.
I wonder, Matt, if some of that for you comes because obviously Chloe Foy has covered Fade Into You, and I think you probably know that version. Did you not know that?
I haven't heard that. No.
Oh, interesting. I thought maybe you'd spent some because that is a much folkier version than this version. So I wondered if that was where you were seeing the big difference between the two because you were used to that version.
I've heard Fade Into You on so many like top 500 songs of all time.
Okay, right. Well, that's us for the 5 albums.
Big moment.
So I think we're on to David Bowie time.
Wow.
So yeah,
we're going to set a timer. You're not getting more than 45 minutes on Bowie.
Yeah, we should talk about what we think of the playlist in general first, shouldn't we? Yeah. That's the point Matt's going to make. I'll go. Average. One very good album.
One word.
One very good album. One album I enjoyed with some questions, and then 3 average to poor albums. So not my favourite playlist, but not my worst. Average.
I would go with almost exactly the same reasoning, but not for the same albums. The Busta was really good. The Mazzy Star was okay. The other 3, I won't go back to. I mean,
that's pretty much the same albums. You just swap the Busta and the Mazzy around. It's pretty much the same albums.
Yeah. But obviously the Tom Beck will only go on for a laughter track.
Slippery fish.
Yeah.
God. It was so goofy. Sorry, I just can't get over how goofy those lyrics were. I would say this is below average. Maybe a lot below average. The only thing I might go back to, I think, is Jean Dawson, just because I think there was some interesting stuff in there. But that made me actually more excited for potentially a second album from them more than anything else.
So, yeah, okay. So not our favourite
No, not really.
No. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm starting the timer on Bowie, right? Okay.
Well, yeah, I've written in my first bullet point, so it's David Bowie in 10 to 15 minutes, so please wish me luck. But yeah, okay, I'll get started. So before I start, I just want to point out that I'm by no means an expert on Bowie and his career. And I know with someone like Bowie, there's going to be people out there who know a lot more than me. And if they're listening to it and want to tweet me and tell me I'm wrong about things, then please don't, because I won't read them. I also know that some people will probably be already shaking their heads at me calling him Bowie instead of Bowie. I know it's not technically right, but that's what I call him. So, that's what it is. So, yeah, we'll move on. So, yeah, once I decided to talk about Bowie in this Why I Love section of the podcast, I spent a lot of time thinking about how I was possibly going to do this. This is a man who released 27 albums in a 49-year music career, and it was no easy task. And when I first put the playlist together, I had 72 songs, which I eventually got down to 20 songs. And I mean, this means songs like Life on Mars weren't on there, Diamond Dogs, a lot of songs that, I had to cut. So it was tough. And then it was tough to decide what to talk about Bowie. So I decided to restrict myself to speaking about 3 elements of his music that make it stand out to me over pretty much any other musician. And the first one of those kind of took me a while to figure out exactly what I meant by it. But I started thinking about the other artists I've talked about on the podcast and what connection there is between them and Bowie. So artists like The National, Nadine Shah and Aldous Harding. And the main thing I came to here was the attention to detail. So many of the artists and bands that I love pay so much attention to every element of every song, and I think none more so than Bowie. Sometimes there's just little tiny things like the guitar solo that comes in to the outro of Let's Dance. It's just, I don't know if many people would have thought to put that guitar solo into the outro of a song, but it takes the song to another level. And then one of my favourite little details in the track Golden Years, there's just a little backing vocal where he says wah 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 like that after every second golden years in the chorus, and it's such a tiny thing, but it makes that song. And if it didn't have that little, it wouldn't be the song it is, and it's an incredible little detail. But the main example I want to use for that is the song "Right," which is from the Young Americans album. So it's probably his most soulful song, and it sounds so loose and free and almost like a jam session at times. But I don't know if anyone's seen the documentary 5 Years about Bowie's career, or 5 years of his career, but you can see the meticulous work he puts into everything. And there's a section of that documentary where he's working with the backing singers to get every little bit of that song right, and it sounds so all over the place at times, but it really isn't. It's really well structured, and you can see the backing singers and the band stressing out because he's so meticulous, but it works. So even when his music sounds haphazard and free, which it often does, he's personally crafted every little bit of it. And I think that's one of the main reasons he's as loved as he is, because there's little things that I think a lot of people won't even notice they love about songs, but they make the songs what they are. So that's the attention to detail. I think my second reason is something I've decided to call transcendent moments in the songs. And by that, I mean these little moments in his songs, whether it's a verse or a single line, that sort of take them to a next level and turn them into something really special. I don't know if everyone does this or just me, but to give you an example of what I mean by these moments, it's kind of sometimes if there's a moment in the song, I will rewind it as soon as I hear it because I want to hear it again. Or if I miss it when I'm listening to the song, I have to put the song back to the start because that's the reason I'm listening to the song. And that happens with a lot of artists, but with Bowie it happens a lot. And I think I'll give you just a few examples. There's some on nearly every song, but one again is on Let's Dance, the line when he sings like a flower for the first time, and he almost screams the word flower, and it's just so, like, it just grabs you. Another's on Ashes to Ashes, when he sings one of my favourite sets of lyrics of all time. The lyrics, I've never done good things, I've never done bad things, I've never done anything out of the blue. I think it's a set of lyrics that turn this song from something quite obscure and something abstract to something really personable and relatable. And finally, on that point, I could probably pick out the whole of Heroes as a transcendent moment. And I think it is one of the few songs in the world that could be considered as the best song ever written, but we can have that argument later. But for me, the final verse of that song stands out as, one of the standout moments in music when he screams, I can remember standing by the wall and the guns shot above our heads and we kissed as though nothing could fall. That just makes the hairs stand up on my arm every time I hear it. And if you don't know, that was one of the songs he wrote while he was in Berlin, and there's the whole Berlin era of Bowie's music, so that was all around the Berlin Wall. So yeah, fantastic. And the final reason, and I think I'm doing all right in actually getting through this relatively quickly, but the final reason is a pretty obvious one that everyone says about Bowie, so I'm not going to dwell on it for too long, but it's the way he changes things up and adapts. So if you look at this playlist, I started with Rubber Band, which was released in 1967, and I finished with Lazarus, which was released in 2016. And if you think of them as the same person, I think it's almost unbelievable. But I hoped that in putting the playlist together, I really demonstrated this adaptability, but also showed the sort of continuity throughout his career. I think he went through soulful stages, he went through rock stages, he went through psychedelic stages, he even went through a krautrock stage, a drum and bass stage, but it was always so clearly him. I included Little Wonder, one of the drum and bass tracks on here, and I think even though it's a drum and bass track, it still has Bowie sort of all over it. And I think that ability was never demonstrated as strongly as it was in 2013 when he came back after 10 years and dropped Where Are We Now from the Next Day album. It's just a totally new sound from him, like a really sort of older, wiser sort of really serious song, which he's not always done in that respect. And then he followed that album with Black Star 3 years later, his final album. So I included two tracks from that. One of them was Girl Like Me, which I included just as an example, really, of how experimental and interesting he still was, even at Death's Door. I mean, that song was apparently inspired by the language used in Clockwork Orange, which I think is just fascinating. And then I included Lazarus just because, as a song that someone wrote when they knew they were dying and sort of left as a message for fans and stuff. I just think it's stunning that someone can finish their career with that. And I think what's really interesting, again, and if you talk about all those different stages of his career, he's always been looking at other people, seeing what they're doing, and then taking bits of it, but creating his own sound with it. I mean, if you look at the soulful stage, he was influenced by people like Stevie Wonder. Drum and bass stage, obviously, he was influenced by all sorts of people. But what he talked about when he released Black Star was that he was really influenced by Kendrick Lamar and the production on To Pimp a Butterfly. And I think you can hear that in the songs, the sort of jazzy elements. But I think it's just fascinating that someone like Bowie is talking about being influenced by someone like Kendrick Lamar at the end of his career, because it just shows that even at that age, he was willing to try and adapt what was fresh and what was happening and what was current and what people were enjoying at the time. So yeah, I've condensed it to 3 of the reasons I love Bowie. I could pick another 30 and I could do another playlist of 52 songs, but I'm going to leave it at that for now. So I'm going to head over to you guys. Who wants to go first?
Matt, why don't you go first?
Sure. I don't know what to say.
That could be a problem.
I have a weird relationship with I also say Bowie because that's what my dad said. I have a weird relationship with David Bowie just because I had almost Stockholm syndrome because my dad was obsessed, and so for the first 18 years of my life, that's all I heard. Like any time my dad was around, because he'd put an album. He has all the albums, all the vinyls. He'd put an album on, and then it would finish, and he'd just press play again. It would just go again and again, and then that would be the weekend, and then next weekend there'll be a new David Bowie album in. And so until I moved out, I kind of had this weird oppressive relationship with it, and then absence made the heart grow fonder, and I actually could have an objective opinion about him as an artist.
It's funny, it's almost exactly the same as me. Like when my parents used to listen to him as a kid, I used to be like, nah, I'm not into this guy. And then when I moved away to uni and like when we lived together, that was when I started to get into him myself, when it wasn't just this music that my parents were making me listening to. So it's interesting to hear that you had that same experience.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah, it's exactly this. I think a lot of people talk about how their parents influence their musical tastes, and often it's giving them stuff. And so with my mum, she was always pushing on me stuff like mod revival stuff, like Paul Weller specials, things like that, Talking Heads, and I took those straight away. But from my dad, probably mirrors my relationship with my dad. It was much more antagonistic. And so it took me a long while to get David Bowie into the fold, but then like he's undeniable, right? There's very few artists that you can make the claim that they were the greatest ever. There's very few songs, few albums that you can actually say are in the conversation, and he is undoubtedly in that. You talk about his influence and his reach. I don't think there's any artist that I can think of that has had such a big impact over such a long period of time across diverse genres as him, because of the way he moved and evolved. And I think that you made some really, really good points, and I think the bit I'd pick up on is the way he is able to comment on what is important in society at the time, right? And so you picked out the Berlin Wall. Like, I have a massive fascination with space, and so him talking about space in the way he did in 1969, and like the ostracization and feeling alone that he portrays in when he's talking about Major Tom, is something that a lot of people were thinking about at the time, and I still think about all the time, and how weird it must be to be out there and to be able to encapsulate that in such a moving way. Is amazing. And to think that song is like 50 years old is
I know it's mad, isn't it?
Mind blowing.
I think it's fascinating as well around the space stuff, because I know some people who I have tried to get into Bowie, who these days, and they hear it and they're like, why does he always sing about space? Like, what is the obsession? But back then, space was a big thing, right? People were trying to figure out. It was constantly in the news. It was constantly being talked about. There was all that sort of stuff going on regularly. The space race and everything. So it was more of a thing then, and I think he was the only one to look at it in sort of that sort of interesting way, not just about who's going to be first to get there and what's important and all that kind of stuff. It was like you say, it was about the isolation and the sort of
it was the human
fascinating
side. I think he started his career when what a lot of people consider to be the greatest human achievement of all time was happening, and so there's a reason he's obsessed with it. But yeah, there's not much we can really say. I think you did a really good job with the playlist. Considering like he's again one of the few artists you could make an argument that if you did a greatest hits album for him, a double album is not enough. And so to be able to make a reasonable playlist and to cover everything from start to finish.
Very tough. Do you have a favourite era, Matt? Just before we move, do you have like a favourite Bowie?
No. I think it's important. Like, I would definitely prefer his older stuff to his newer stuff, but by older stuff I mean probably a 20-year period. I think my favorite album is a live album. His recording in Philadelphia, which was during his like Young Americans phase. Young Americans is
my favorite album personally. Yeah. So.
You should listen. If you haven't listened to the Live in Philadelphia album, there's a lot of very good live music. He expands on a lot of the songs in an interesting way.
I don't think I've heard it, weirdly, so I'll look it up today, probably.
Do it.
Cool. Okay, so from two people who have a very old relationship with Bowie through parents, I know you don't really, Nick.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting place to start, actually. Yeah, is that it's really interesting, since I'm so obsessed with music on so many levels, that there are people who've just passed me by. And I was actually talking to my mum about this morning, about the fact we were doing the Bowie. Second shout out to my mum in one podcast. And I realised, she's much more into it than I realised she was. She was talking about lots of details about the various periods and the albums and stuff. But I don't remember really listening to it much growing up at all. there were other people, other big sort of towering figures like Hendrix and stuff that were really big on my parents' radar, but Bowie was not really. Yeah, so in that sense, it was great to have this as a playlist to get into it and get to understand more about what was going on, having missed this sort of giant, in lots of ways. So I think my overarching comment would be, well, this is not a criticism because I actually really enjoyed it, but I thought it was actually a lot less odd than I was expecting, given the sort of aura around him. It was actually had some really, some great tracks that were refinements of the pop song. And I think it sounds to me like from what I've seen of interviews of his that he would freely admit that was what he was shooting for. Yep. And they were sort of refinements of it that worked really well, and they had like a very clear structure, and they had repetition in the choruses and stuff. Now, for some reason, again, misinformed about it, I had assumed it was going to be really, really weird. And maybe it's the playlist songs you picked. I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with his stuff, but I was expecting it to be really all over the place and like super odd ball, and a lot of it was not. There were a few bits later on in the list that were a bit more odd, but of course it's reasonable to argue, I think you probably will argue, that he was defining what was normal in a way, and he was redefining what the scope was of the entire musical enterprise, so I can definitely see that. But again, when I listen to some of these songs, even in the middle period of this playlist, they're still very clearly verse, chorus, bridge, verse, chorus structures. There were little details, though. I was interested when you're talking about the small details and these sort of nuanced perspective that I thought really were interesting to me. So, for example, I would guess he was pretty early, maybe very early, in the use of some reverbs and stuff that he does on. There's a track, there's Moon Age, Daydream, for example. Towards the end of that song, things sort of drift away on what I assume is a plate reverb they were using. But I would assume, given the year, I don't know what year that was, but fairly early, that was a pretty early instance of the use of that kind of technology. So he definitely had those details. But I found that really surprising overall. Yeah. So.
I think that's just to comment on that while you're talking about it. I think the interesting thing is that he did oddball things, and I included the song from Low, which I can never pronounce, Warsfarver, to show that kind of what he did for a little while. But I think what people who haven't experienced, I think that he was an oddball human. Yeah. And what I didn't want to do today, and was careful not to do really, was to spend too much time talking about him as a person, because that's a whole other podcast and that's a whole other thing. But I think people do think that his music's really oddball because he was an oddball person, when actually his music is, quite straightforward, but actually influencing a lot of other things. I think, some of the stuff, like you said, he's led the way in some things that now feel less oddball, but were oddball a little bit when they came out. But I think you're right. I don't think his music is as oddball as people assume it's going to be sometimes.
So I wondered, as in part, and you can answer this in a moment, whether you thought there were periods that were dips in this variety of periods that he went through in quality, because I felt there were some tracks that I was less interested in. It was generally a bit towards the earlier stuff. It got steadily more interesting as he went through, I suppose. So, for example, you included Rubber Band at the start. Was that for like the historical narrative of what he had done, or because you think it's a really
Rubber Band was
song?
in there because it's. To be honest, I was going to fit this into my intro. Rubber Band. The main reason I included that was that really it's to show where he was, because actually I think another thing that people think with Bowie and assume is that he was this ready-made pop star, this ready-made musician, and he was just there. But actually, he released that album, David Bowie, the debut, with Rubber Band on it, and it flopped, and it was then quite a long time until he made it with Space Oddity. He had to work very hard to sort of get his career off the ground, and nearly gave up several times. So that's kind of why I included Rubber Band, because that was what he was doing, and it wasn't. Rubber Band is not a great song. It's the best song on that album. Yeah. So
that's what I was hoping you were going to say, because I thought as a historical document it was important to recognise. I definitely see it from that perspective. Obviously, it's not. Well, not obviously. To me, it's a lot weaker than a lot of the other tracks on the playlist. In fact, I would say the earlier stuff, particularly the use of horns and stuff, and you're going to hate this, seemed to me to be like a more experimental version of some late Beatles stuff. And obviously, I know it's of the same period. I know you're not a fan of the Beatles at all, Fran, but I did think that like some of the arrangements of like horns and strings and stuff was not a million miles away from pushing the Beatles further than they had gone. So, but I suppose they
I'm
were
sure
of
he
the
would
time.
he would definitely claim them as a big influence as well. I imagine so. Yeah.
And there were moments when he actually references Beatles lyrics and stuff. I can't remember the exact instance now, but there's some moments where he does talk about Beatles lyrics in this playlist, even let alone in other things, I'm sure. So overall, I feel like I'm rambling slightly, but I think there's a lot to think about, a lot to say. I will come back to it, and I think it's. I don't know if it's all consistently fantastic, but I definitely enjoyed it, and I'm glad we got through it. So.
I think interestingly, it's when my first idea when I set out to do this was that I was going to show some of because there's not the amount of albums he put out and the amount of stuff. There was some terrible stuff that he put out, and I did want to sort of demonstrate that a little bit. I didn't really in the end include much other than. I mean, I don't think Rubber Band's terrible, but that, and I was not a big fan of his drum and bass period. Little Wonder I quite like as a song because it's fun, but the album as a whole I was not into. And actually, I would say from Let's Dance, which is, I can't remember the exact year, but I think it was maybe 83, he really started to go off the boil for a while. His end of the 80s stuff is not good. So there's a big patch here between that Let's Dance album to when Little Wonder came out, where I didn't include anything off around 4 or 5 albums. So there was dips.
I think we've had this conversation before, haven't we, with various people on our Why I Love stuff. Are we trying to represent everything that they've ever done, or are we trying to represent the peaks of that stuff for us? And
I don't think you could do with Bowie. I had to choose one or the other. I don't think you could because there's so much stuff that it was hard to do. But interested, Nick, because you talked about liking some of the later stuff more. Was there a particular couple of songs or one of the albums that you felt you liked the stuff off more than others? Or
I suppose I liked. And I wasn't huge into Little Wonder, but the last 3 songs I really liked are the ones of Black Star, and Black Star's one we talked about before, isn't it? So when it came out, we talked about it.
We didn't do it on the. I think you and Nermal did it before we started all this because I remember you saying that it was your comment about it was it's just very Bowie. I thought. It's really not though, so it's quite interesting. But
it's got his voice.
Yeah, which is very, very able to be parodied, as it were. But that's because it's so ubiquitous, So so I would guess I did really like Heroes. I did really like those effects I was talking about. I think "Oh You Pretty Thing" is probably my favourite song actually, though, on it.
Okay.
I just think that hook is really great. Although, again, it's boxed off in a way that I was not expecting it to be. There's points in the second, I think it's the second chorus, when the piano kind of everything drops out except for the piano to do the dun 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 dun. Oh, it kind of has this pause in order to fit with the structure. And I was expecting him to bend it a bit more and do something weirder, and he didn't on that occasion, which is fine. But again, that just underlines my point. I was expecting it to be all over the shop, and it wasn't. So but no, that was probably my high point. Was "Oh You Pretty Thing" is one of my favourite.
I'd say maybe listen to the Hunky Dory then as your next thing, the album Hunky Dory, because that was actually the one. Like I say, Young Americans is my favourite album, but Hunky Dory was the one that I struggled to cut down to just 2 songs.
Right.
Like I originally had about 6 songs off Hunky Dory, just because they demonstrate a lot of different things about Bowie. So I think maybe listen to that album next as your homework.
Thank you very much for assigning me homework. That's great.
And both watch 5 years if you haven't already.
I've seen some of that. Yeah, I don't think I've seen all of it. I've seen some of that.
I should watch that. I think with some of what you were saying, Nick, as well. Like I don't think he invented a lot of things, but he really had his ear to the ground and his big thing is having a good ear, finding the sound that he wants to incorporate and make mainstream almost.
And I think that's what happened with Young Americans, isn't it? It's like, he came up, he'd just done Rebel Rebel and Diamond Dogs are probably his rockiest album, which if I'm being honest is my least favourite Bowie era, really. And then he came back with Young Americans, which is just incredibly soulful because that was what was doing well at the time, but he adapted it and made it his own sort of thing. So I think, he was always doing that.
Yeah, that was fun.
Okay.
So thank you.
No worries. Seems relatively positive. I'm just glad you didn't just end by saying, it was shit, Nick, because I didn't know how you would.
That's what you fully expected, was it?
So, no, I didn't expect you to think it was shit, but I didn't know how into it you would get. So it sounds like you did all right. Cool. Okay. So I think that's us.
Yes.
Next time, it is going to be a sort of album of the year special. So we will each talk about our own album of the year, and we're going to pick some from some of the sort of magazines and websites and their choices. So we'll be discussing them, and we'll tell you what they are. So next time.
We're going to have 9 albums altogether. Is that right? Am I doing
yes,
the maths
it will
right?
be 9 albums. We're each picking 2 from websites, etc., and our own one. So yeah, that's 9 in total.
Yeah. It's going to be an epic, basically.
We'll do it in the sort of round robin questions type thing, though, to make sure it doesn't last for 3 hours. So.
That's fair enough. Yeah.
Oh, and go to the website, pickybs.com. Follow us on Twitter @pickybastards. And yeah, we'll speak to you in January. You won't speak to us, but we will speak to you.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
But you can always speak to us on Twitter.
You can.
If
Unless it's to tell me I pronounce Bowie wrong.
Yeah.
Weirdly enough, I actually used to call him Bowie, and it was only since you chastised me for it that I've started calling him Bowie, thinking that was the norm, and now you just told me today that isn't the norm.
I honestly think that it's. I think that it was Bowie until, and this is when people are going to tweet me if they get to the end of this part. But I think that
this is the test of everyone listening to the end.
Getting out in America, it became Bowie, and I think he just went with it because I think it's Bowie. But anyway, we'll leave it there.
All right, thanks a lot then.
All right,
see you later.
Bye.
Bye.